can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I am loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing.
If God is gracious, that means He gives us everything we want, right? If you study Scripture, it doesn't take long to be dispelled of that notion. The real question for us is, will we find God's grace sufficient? Brad McKinnon is, among other things, Associate Professor of History at Heritage Christian University, and in this lesson he talks to us about the sufficiency of God's grace.
My grace is sufficient for you. By the time we get to the end of 2 Corinthians, Paul and probably the Corinthians are all in need of a little grace. If you look back at 2 Corinthians chapter 2, you'll find out that there was someone who publicly opposed Paul. That caused some stress, but apparently had been rectified. By the time we get to chapter 12, there are some other problems developing. For instance, the Corinthians themselves felt insulted because Paul did not accept support from them like he had accepted from other congregations. They felt slighted. And a group has developed, some rivals, you might say, to Paul that are opposing him in Corinth that he mockingly calls the super apostles. And it's in that context that Paul responds to his critics. And he responds to his critics at the end of chapter 11 by listing his accomplishments. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 22, he asks a series of rhetorical questions. Are these super apostles, or these rivals, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? And then after asking that question, Paul, it's almost pauses for just a second, and he begins to reflect back on all the experiences that he has had in his ministry, in his mission travels for the gospel of Christ. And he begins to list all these things that he's suffered. He talks about labors. He talks about imprisonments. He talks about floggings, even to the point of near death. He talks about being stoned. He talks about being shipwrecked. He talks about being danger by bandits. He talks about being danger in the wilderness, at the sea, and on and on and on. And after listing all of these experiences, all of the suffering that he has done for the cause of Christ, when we get to chapter 12, it's almost like Paul pauses for just a second, sort of catches himself and thinks, what am I doing? I'm sort of boasting and bragging and about my relationship with Jesus. I'm boasting and bragging about my service to the Lord and the gospel, and that's probably not quite appropriate. But he says this to begin the chapter. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Paul catches himself in mid-sentence and he thinks, nothing can be gained by boasting like this. It is not by my grace or by my power these things have been done. But my critics, my rivals, have sort of put me in a position where I have to sort of boast. I have to sort of brag. Even though nothing can be gained by it, I'm sort of caught in the middle and have to say something. And it's at that point that Paul tells this really strange story about this sort of out-of-body experience. He talks about himself in the third person, apparently. And I don't know if that's a rhetorical device. I don't know if that is Paul trying to be humble. But he talks about being caught up to the third heaven, or to paradise, verses 3 and 4. And he says, my critics, they don't have as close a connection to Jesus as I do, because I've seen these heavenly visions, things that I, as a human being, can't even utter. I've been able to experience these things. But when he starts thinking about boasting or talking about these experiences, he realizes there's a problem here. And the Lord did too. The problem is that there are two extremes when you think about our relationship with God and our relationship with each other, and thinking about the notion of grace. There's the idea that I'm indispensable to the cause of Christ. I've got so many talents, so many abilities. I'm so good that really God can't do any work on this earth without me. And the other extreme is that I've made so many mistakes. I don't live up to God's expectations, and therefore He couldn't possibly use me. And Paul realizes there's a danger in both of those ways of thinking. And as I mentioned, the Lord obviously recognizes that as well. And Paul says, in order to avoid the first extreme, the idea that I'm so great, I'm so good, I've had so many wonderful experiences, God couldn't possibly carry on without me. Paul says that he was given a thorn in the flesh. Now, we don't know exactly what this is, but based on the language Paul uses, this is something that brought him pain. It brought a certain amount of struggle into his life that manifests itself physically in some way. And it's interesting how Paul thinks about this thorn in the flesh. He calls it a messenger, or sarcastically, a gift from Satan. Paul certainly didn't view it truly as a gift in the sense that he enjoyed the process, but he understood that it was a gift in the sense that it kept him humble. It helped him approach the notion of his relationship with God and his relationship with others under the umbrella of grace in its proper perspective. But even though he viewed it in some ways as a gift, he wanted to be rid of it. And so he prayed to the Lord 3 times, and here is our topic for today. The Lord responded, in essence, "No, my grace is sufficient for you," 2 Corinthians 12:9. "For power is made perfect in weakness." And so as we think about grace, and as we think about the idea that the Lord's grace is sufficient for us, there are some important things that we can note from the text. First of all, when we think about God's grace, it ought to encourage us to know that when God is involved in our lives, there's a certain amount of power, there's a certain amount of activity where God's blessing us, and that ought to alleviate some of the worries that sometimes we face. And so even though Paul here, he calls this thorn in the flesh a messenger or a gift from Satan, it is the Lord that is controlling the outcome. And so even though Satan has some power, Satan's power here is limited, and it's limited by God, and the Lord is, as I mentioned, is developing a response and is determining the outcome. The second thing I notice is that when we think about grace being sufficient, it's this second part of the phrase, that power is made perfect in weakness. When we think about earthly power, when we think about the power structures in this world, certainly people do not typically rise to power out of weakness. They typically rise to power out of strength, out of overwhelming force. But here, Jesus says, in my kingdom, It's sort of turned upside down. That the way up is down, the way down is up. The idea or the notion of power or strength is actually manifested in weakness. And so there's a reminder for Paul in two ways. Number one, don't ever think that you are so important, that you are indispensable, that you are not in need of God's grace. My grace is sufficient. You don't need a Jesus plus theology. The idea that yes, we need a relationship with the Lord, but we also need some kind of precise and perfect response to God's grace. We don't need that. The second thing is that even though I fail from time to time, and Paul struggled with his interpersonal relationships here with the Corinthians. He may have even made some mistakes in how he interacted with them, but the Lord's grace was sufficient to overcome any of the problems, any of the mistakes that Paul had made. And so as we think about the sufficiency of the grace of the Lord, this brings us to our own time. And as I think about how we interact with each other, and think about any interpersonal relationship, it could be in the church, it could be in our families, what kind of problems develop if we don't think of ourselves in relationship to the Lord's grace in a way that comports with what we're hearing here? For instance, church problems often develop because one person or one group thinks of himself or herself or themselves as superior to somebody else. And Jesus' message to Paul is his message to us, and that is, you don't achieve greatness in the kingdom of Christ because you're great. You don't want to list all of your achievements and boast about them as if your particular congregation or the church as a whole or what the Lord is doing in this world is dependent strictly on you. My grace is sufficient. The second side is true as well, and that is that we can begin thinking that we are of no good, of no use to anyone. And so my grace is sufficient is humbling on the one hand, but it's encouraging on the other. And I think ultimately this message, what it tells us is that everybody isn't important and everybody is important. In other words, God is going to do what God wants to do. God is going to do things in this world, remaking this world into what's right, regardless of how we as individuals respond. And so in a sense, we're not important. You see, because the Lord is in control here. But on the other hand, all of us are important. There's another sense in which God views us as all important in the work that he's doing in this world and allows us to be part of it. And so as we reflect on this passage, I'd like to think with you for just a few moments about how this could transform our relationships. You may be going through some interpersonal conflict. There may be somebody that is opposing you for some reason or another, and you're trying to rectify that situation much like Paul did. There may be people that are upset, disappointed in decisions that you've made. Maybe it's the right decision. Maybe looking back on it, you feel like you've made a mistake and you hurt people because of that mistake. Or there may be people that are considering themselves rivals to what you're trying to accomplish in the work of the Lord. How can these ideas help us transform those relationships? Well, think about it. If, in a sense, no one is important, that the importance lies solely in God, doesn't that transform our relationships where we can act more humble and gracious with each other? I think about Paul sort of being tempted here to list all his accomplishments. But think about what we can achieve together when we don't care who gets the credit because it's all about God anyway. And then I think about the other side, and that is, what can happen when we not just receive grace for ourselves from the Lord, but we in turn share that grace with other people? Think about how that can transform our relationships with each other, and how that can bring us closer in community together as we serve the Lord. So many problems exist in congregations because of interpersonal conflict. Maybe you're disappointed by a decision that someone has made, and although you enjoy receiving grace yourself, when you make such mistakes, you're having a little bit harder time allowing someone else to enjoy that grace as well. But you realize we're all in need of it, and that it's sufficient. It changes how you respond to people, doesn't it? It changes how you interact with people. And so the church becomes a welcoming, forgiving, and encouraging place where everyone matters, where everyone counts. And so there's this weird sort of juxtaposition here where on the one hand, because of God's grace, no one really matters because it's all about God. And on the other hand, because of God's grace, everyone matters because everyone has the opportunity to receive and be encouraged by the grace of God, because it is, in fact, sufficient. And ultimately, I think what God is calling us to do through this passage is to maintain a sense of humility, a sense of an understanding of our place and what God is doing in this world. Sometimes we suffer, sometimes we go through struggles, and we cry out to God and we wonder, is God listening? And just like the Lord was listening to Paul, the Lord listens to us, and he responds, my grace is sufficient. Sometimes we get to thinking a little bit too good of ourselves. We become a little haughty in how we think about our importance to the Lord's work and our importance in a particular congregation. And Jesus responds to that too. My grace is sufficient. And so as we think about the grace of the Lord and what we learn about it from this text, I think that's what we leave. That the grace of God is sufficient to make me everything that I can't be on my own. And the grace of the Lord is sufficient to humble me, to help me realize that it's not all about me. In fact, it's not about me at all, but it's about the Lord, and it's about what we can do together in order to serve him in this world and to live out his values together in community.
There is an endless song echoes in my soul. I hear the music ring, and though the storms may come, I am holding on, and to the